Alright, this is turn 37 of Degeneracy. My pretender tried to mind hunt out a commander, but was unable to actually successfully kill anyone. Here in Underhome, this is where I was trying to attack into an advancing Atlantean army in the hopes of being able to capture the province when they moved out from it, but I guessed incorrectly, and I wound up facing two of these mages here, and a bunch of these Atlantean infantries, which easily overwhelmed the small amount of skeletons that my two mages could put out. Here in the Sodden Murk, this was a swamp province, which Agartha just reclaimed with a bunch of its heavy infantry. Here in Lake Vastness, I ran into a huge stack of turtle warriors. So these are amphibious units, which Agartha was most likely using in order to take underwater provinces, and while not particularly strong, when they outnumber the ghosts that they're fighting by a huge enough margin, then they should have no problem killing them. They have a decent amount of protection for a low-tech amphibious unit. These are actually units which are nationals for Pelagia in EA, and while it's not particularly great for LA, it's still enough to be able to reduce the damage from the ghostly spears by quite a bit once they do damage, assuming that they're not negated by magic resistance beforehand, and again, they just outnumber them by enough to be able to kill them in spite of the etherealness. Witherland, I did not put province defense on. This might even have been one of Agartha's forts which I was walking away from, but either way, Agartha took it back. Here in Kunaral, I was actually successfully able to raid with skeleton spam, but, you know, not much there, just taking on province defense with skeletons. Here I was also able to successfully raid one of Agartha's provinces, but this one does have a fort, so I was just beating Agartha's heavy infantry province defense. Here in Sailor's Haven, we actually had that big fight with Mictlan, where we were intercepting his squads of Jaguar warriors. So you can see that he's just using box formation. And I actually have a fair amount of both mage support and a lot of crossbows on my side, in addition to the additional archers from province defense, along with the province defense's infantry. So between my archers and crossbows, I'm actually able to do a fair amount of... I'm able to launch a fair amount of attacks on these guys before they even get their bless up, which means that there's no risk of B9 damage from those attacks. Additionally, he doesn't have a prophet or another H3 priest. He has only this tribal king and a single H1 priest, which means that many of these guys are not going to be able to be blessed for quite some time. Let's show grid. And the other thing I wanted to check was team code squares. Right, okay, so this guy right over here was actually successfully converted with Apostasy, which is my national holy spell which enables me to charm enemies, but he is also surrounded by the enemy, so he's most likely not going to survive for very long to join the glorious cause. So you can kind of see here that he definitely outnumbers my frontline units, but because his guys are all bunched up, they actually aren't hitting with quite as high of a surface area as they could be, and many of these guys are basically just getting stuck behind their own guys as a result, like this square right over here, which isn't hitting anyone, while meanwhile my archers and crossbows are able to fire right over my guys, who are for the most part all already engaged. He does manage to get something of a surround going on over here, but this is also where my animated skeletons and soulless are going to be going, so there's basically a replenishing front line going there. And then the same is true over here, where my horde of skeletons casts are filtering forward to help hold up the enemy, while my crossbows and archers continue to fire. most part, his front line is definitely beating mine up, and you can kind of see that just by how many of my guys have already lost, and the fact that this squad here is already routing. However, these guys have been continuing to shoot throughout the course of the fight, which has been whittling down his front line as well, and he doesn't have anyone behind his guys, so as he takes attrition from his front line, that's basically it. So this fight was very close, and his guys were even able to kill all the way through the line holders and the skeletons that I'd animated along the way, but because he had taken so many losses doing so, and was even continuing to be shot at while he was in melee range, his guys weren't able to stay in range of the crossbows and archers long enough to get rid of them as well. The other thing which went in my favor for this fight was the fact that I had a couple fear auras on his guys which reduced his morale, and while that didn't stick around long enough in order to make them rout just from the fear auras alone, it did help to reduce the morale enough that when the squad was taking damage, the average morale was lowered by enough for them to run. The other thing which helped is that while my front line did in fact die and I lost a lot of HP in the process, because I was continuing to reanimate the soulless and even had a bunch of reanimated skeletons as part of that front line, the actual HP on the battlefield was kept high in spite of the fact that a significant portion of what I'd started the fight with did in fact go down, because these guys don't actually count towards the max HP in terms of causing a rout, but they do act or they do count in terms of how much HP is on the battlefield at any given point. So that means that basically they're helping to provide an HP anchor to prevent my troops from running away. So in the end, I wasn't able to successfully recruit any more than one Jaguar warrior from the apostasy cast as it was coming away, and I did lose one of the Lemuria acolytes from where my front line on the northern flank collapsed. However, I was able to take the fight handily and kill a huge number of these sacreds, and again, as we saw, many of them weren't even blessed. It's possible that if he had brought an H3 priest, he would have been able to turn the fight, both from being able to bless all of his troops at once, and by providing additional banishment to get rid of my ghosts and skeletons more quickly. Here in Apriskia, we lost a province to Miklin's raiding, so this was just province defense and a single ghost, facing a bunch of demons and stuff. Here in Stone Heavens, we again lose a province to a bunch of sacreds and green lions, this time led by a slightly higher level priest from Atlantis' side. And then here in Momef, we raid one of Agartha's provinces, again just with a very small band of ghosts. And then here in the Range of Shadow, we actually take on Agartha's full army. We've already seen his formation when we went over it before. It's basically just a line of heavy infantry, a bunch of skeleton spammers, undead infantry here at the south, and crossbows backing up his guys right back there. My formation has a large amount of province defense, which unfortunately has the crossbowmen ahead of the light infantry and so on, so that kind of sucks. And then I have, because I bought so much province defense, I even get some of my national units, which are these ghosts right over here. Luckily they're up there at the front. And then I have additional archers and a whole bunch of auras down here at the south. It's worth noting that because these guys all have javelin attacks, they're viable targets for the Fire Archers command, and because they have shields and are ethereal, I'd much rather have them be shot at than the actual crossbowmen, even the ones that are just from province defense. While Shadow Blast doesn't have any effect on undead, that just means that it's going to avoid targeting these lower value guys and is instead going to be hitting these very high protection, but only very modest magic resistance entrance guards and blind fighters. And that was actually really great because even though it only killed a couple squares of these crossbows right over here, it actually paralyzed a few of them as well. And naturally the paralyzed units aren't going to be doing anything. And the same is true for his front line right over here. Many of these blind fighters which weren't actually killed were still paralyzed, which is going to prevent them from joining the fight, and means that they're going to have 0 attack and defense if my guys reach them while they're still paralyzed. And you can see here that many of these attacks are actually being repelled, thanks to the fact that these guys have only length 2 swords, whereas these guys are using length 4 spears. And it's also worth reiterating the fact that Long Dead have very low magic resistance, comparatively, which means that they're liable to take damage from these spectral attacks, even if they do have piercing resistance to help make them take a bit less damage from it. Also, it's worth noting that his reanimators are now exhausted, which means it's going to be several rounds before they're able to summon additional skeletons, so this front line which he has right now is basically about as big as it's going to get. I'm just speeding up the fight now just because, yeah, it's going to take a little while for these magic resist negate relatively modest damage weapons to carve through this huge old front line of guys. In fact, much of the damage that's being done from both sides is just the ranged attacks, ranging from my own javelins and crossbows to the crossbows on his side. It's also worth noting that these Winter Wolves did get mixed up in amongst my province defense, and their cold ores actually numbed a bunch of my infantry, so these guys are getting fatigued out. So his mages have started waking back up again, so they're summoning yet additional skeletons. However, I've also summoned additional soulless of my own, thanks to the fact that my guys defaulted to casting Raise Dead. And with that, my army is now sufficiently outnumbering Agartha's, so it's both breaking through his front line a little bit right over here, and it's completely surrounding it here on the sides. Just to look at something real quick, these guys here are totally exhausted now from all the extended time they've been spending in the fight, and especially these guys here because they've been hit by the cold doors from the wolves. These guys do have reinvigoration from his Bless because he has Earth 6 from his Pretender, and then he also has Undying +6 from the D6 on his Pretender. So as I think we'd mentioned this earlier, but he took an E6, D6, and then some blood on a Tomb Oracle. Or a Risen Oracle, rather, the Pretender Tomb Oracle chassis. So the idea with that is that he's going to be able to cast some big spells, and then he also has this Incidental Blast, which helps out these high encumbrance blind fighters. However, their fatigue is still building up thanks to the fact that the reinvigoration is only 3, whereas their encumbrance is 9, which means that their attack and defense isn't quite as high as it would appear to be from their both naturally high stats and the experience bonus that they have, because the fatigue applies a large penalty to both of those. And at least one of his squads of blind fighters has now started to rout. His defenders of the hall had already routed, so these guys are quickly being chewed through, and my guys will soon be able to charge forward onto his mages and crossbows. The fighting has gone on long enough, and I've taken enough losses that even some of my ghosts are starting to rout as well. So when an army falls below a certain HP threshold, but before it reaches the auto-rout threshold of 75%, the army takes actually morale checks. So you can see that these guys here failed, I think, the 50% morale check, although it could be one above that. But either way, even with the skeletons giving them additional HP, they've lost enough of their guys that their entire army was forced to take a morale check, and many of their guys are now fleeing. Their army isn't completely routed, however, and these guys are still holding strong, both the crossbows and looks like some of his mages are actually just fatigued out and thus not able to run. So he's most likely going to hit the 75% HP threshold soon, and the only mages which are going to remain on the battlefield are the ones too exhausted to retreat. So, that fight went on for a very long time, and ultimately it was a resounding success. We killed 5 of these reanimators and one of the servants of the oracles, who were too exhausted to retreat. We killed a blind lord who charged forward into combat. And then we killed, of course, a huge number of his guys in general. 69 of these sacreds, but not as many of these crossbows on account of the fact that they were held at the very back, so they weren't even engaged upon until his army was already about to rout. In the meantime, we lost one of our Grand Lemurs, most likely just from a crossbow shot that was just incredibly lucky and was able to hit way back at that corner of the battlefield. And then, of course, we lost a huge number of ghosts thanks to the fact that they were stuck in the fight for so long, with all of the crossbows and even just the regular skeletons continuing to hit at them throughout the course of that battle. He wasn't casting any Dust to Dust or other ghost removal spells until the very end of the fight, and because he didn't bring any gems, he also wasn't able to do Wither Bones, which would have given him a much wider, big area of effect option. Additionally, because he didn't bring Chthonian Alchemists and was instead relying on his D-Mages, he didn't have Flaming Arrows, he didn't have Fire Elementals, or any of the other stuff that actually would be able to clear out huge numbers of undead. So as a result, I was able to kill this big ball of troops and keep hold of my province. Here in the Ocean of Despair, we just have a province get captured, again, just by a large enough number of Atlantis' guys that there wasn't much to say about it. Here in the Lake Eternal, our raiding party was successful thanks to the fact that it wasn't facing a big old ball of Atlanteans. Here in Golriep, he is once again, I think this is his thing with all the Acertuts. Yeah, so that was that big ol' army back in his territory now. Here in Land's End, this is that same stack we've already seen with only 2 mages and a reasonable number of crossbows, just continuing to do some raiding around the northern end of my territory. Here in Pescan, we do in fact run into some defenders from Agartha when we're trying to go capture this province. He left these Flame Barrel Nightmares, which would have been brought along with his other dudes, here with this mage, and one of them charges forward. And it explodes dramatically. And as you can see, it's not really a huge impactful effect. Many of my guys didn't take a whole lot of damage in spite of the fact that they have 0 protection, and that was magical fire damage. So a single fire elemental would definitely have been able to kill all these guys on its own, and a Flame Barrel Nightmare was decidedly less impressive. Luckily for him, it did enough damage that even this regular scale spam was enough to actually chew through my ghosts. And with that, he's able to hold his province defense with some poorly spent fire gems in the form of this Flame Barrel Nightmare and an actual mage and a decent amount of province defense. These Dark Vines probably would have been able to hold off my ghosts all on their own thanks to the fact they have a huge amount of magic resistance, a big HP pool, and piercing resistance to be able to basically stand in front of my ghosts forever and then slowly wither them down with their own battering attacks. Here in Valador, we just raid another province, lose a couple of the dispossessed spirits which we don't care about. Atlantis retakes another province, Atlantis retakes another province, and Atlantis retakes another province. He has huge numbers of troops that he's actively deploying against me now, so even though this is probably too many to be efficient for recapturing provinces, he has enough guys that he can afford it. Here we get a luck event which just increases our luck, so more potential good times ahead. And here we have a helpful necromancer and some soulless minions. We finally capture this false prophet and some heretics here with that patrolling force, and the fortress which we've raided on top of is not being breached, which means that there's a fair number of Agarthans inside of it. And we've hired some villains right over here, which can potentially help us with some raiding, along with these crossbows which the Shadow Tribune is picking up. So, Atlantis definitely hit back hard. He's recaptured a huge number of provinces over here in the basically the borderlands between us, and meanwhile he's also recaptured a bunch of aquatic provinces right over here. Our attempts to bounce off of his army are met with his dudes, and while we're able to capture this province by successfully attacking into it from here, we do lose some of the necromancers, or death mages I mean, by attacking into where his guys in fact were. Given that this is a relatively small group of guys right over here, and we still have a fair amount of crossbow province defense from right over here in order to face off against Miklin, we are at least going to cause some attrition if he combines these armies over here. Because this army is so much bigger than this one, it can march into it, and if he tries to attack into this army with all 3, it's most likely going to kill only this group. So, Marignon split up his guys reasonably well, but not well enough that each of them can take on this army. So we basically are continuing to dodge out Marignon's big stacks, or rather he's continuing to dodge out against mine. And elsewhere, we are basically just continuing on the raiding game. The fact that we lost so many ghosts in this army means that it's no longer quite as impressive of a stack. But Agartha also was beaten back, and given that he's been playing so cautiously, he's most likely going to become even more cautious thanks to the fact that he took a huge number of losses there. These guys right over here have lost too many ghosts. They can no longer continue their underwater raiding, so they're going to go back up north to regroup with my guys right over here and potentially pick up more ghosts in order to bring with them on their raiding missions. So yeah, we were able to win a dramatic fight finally, and well, we did in fact manage to pull off a win there. Overall, this turn wasn't that great just because of the fact that Atlantis has deployed so many troops against us and has been able to retake so many provinces. Because this guy lost his front line of ghosts, he's going to need to sneak out, and I don't necessarily trust that Agartha or Atlantis is going to not be patrolling anywhere, so I'm going to sneak him south, and hopefully he'll be able to find a province that says that it has only a single commander and a few loyal henchmen, because if I can find a 1 to 3 PD province, then he should be able to solo it with his skelly spam, but if he attacks into a province with too much province defense, then he's just going to die, and we don't want that. So, war's actually looking pretty good against Agartha at this point. With that one big loss, I'm going to be emboldened to raid further into his territory. And Marignon is still not causing any severe damage, thanks to the fact that he is also playing relatively cautiously, and having killed all those sacreds right over here belonging to Micklin, we can make another go at taking on this fort right over here, and we're just going to continue raiding with additional ghost reinforcements, which this guy's bringing up from that fort. And that's the turn.